Hello, everyone. Welcome back. So, in an earlier session, we talked about the different product related decisions like branding, positioning, and packaging. But those decisions are made taking the product as given. Okay, so once the product has been out, those are the decisions that we start making. So, in this particular session, actually, I want to talk about the different stages of the new product development process. But before we do that, let me start with a very brief discussion of how critical these new products are to the success of any company. Now, if you look at a company like Gillette, which is known for its dominance in the razor and the blades market, what many of us may not know is that Gillette also owns a lot of other top brands in many other product categories like Duracell, Right Guard, Soft and Dry, Parker and Papermate, Oral-B, and keep going. I can just keep going. So one of the things that's actually worth noting is that each of these brands is one of the top brands, and if not the top brand in some respect, so if not the top brand, but it's actually one of the top brands in the respective product categories. Now, because of this, a recent article in the Wall Street Journal labeled Gillette as a new product machine was published. So this is a company that thrives on innovations and recognizes that its new products will cannibalize the sales of its own top brands. But nevertheless, this company still continues to invest and it brings out new products at a very rapid pace. So, for instance, the new razors they introduce cannibalize the sales of their existing top razors, right? Because they keep coming up with new products under different brand names or improved names. Even in the same brand name, in the same category, they come up with an improved version of a product. So, certainly that can cannibalize the sales of their existing top razors. Now, the idea here is related to our earlier discussion on marketing myopia. So, if you recall, the idea there was that there is an underlying need that the customers are trying to fulfill with your product. And if that need gets fulfilled better with a competing offering or with a newer technology, that will spell the doom of your product. So it's important to maintain focus on the underlying need that is being served by a product offering. So if you understand this idea, and if this is the idea that Gillette embraces, right? So which is that if we don't fulfill the need of the consumer better, someone else will. Right. So even if their own products get cannibalized, the sales gets cannibalized when they come up with an improved version of the product. But it's more like why leave the money on the table or why leave the market untapped for a competitor because their sales. And so it's better to actually innovate and bring out a new product, even if it cannibalizes their sales, rather than letting someone else innovate and cannibalize their sales. So that's really their philosophy. Now, that is a mark of a successful company. And that is the reason why new products are critical to the success of a company. Now, there are many challenges actually that a company faces, especially in the packaged goods. A lot of products fail as well. And we'll talk about product failures as well later. But let me talk about some of the challenges. So, some of these challenges are not within the control of the company. For example, if you think about high definition TV, which has only taken off in the last 10 years or so. But the technology actually had been around for a very long time. So the first HD TV was in fact produced in the 70s. So it took a long time for the product to diffuse into the market. And some of you may be surprised here. So a lot of it had to do with the price of the product being too high or the economies of scale not being large enough to drop prices. Now, even if the companies were able to lower prices, there is the issue of consumption value of the product. So let me elaborate on that. Now, if you buy an HDTV for several thousand years when it was initially introduced, why would you buy such an expensive TV in the first place? It better be that the clarity of the pictures and the sound of the programming that you're watching is significantly better than what you could get from a regular analog TV. However, the TV is simply providing you with the hardware to watch the programming. So, unless there is high definition programming that is available to watch, the HD TV is of limited use. Okay, so the programming, of course, is developed by a different party because this was the technology behind HDTV, right? So the HDTV, so the technology was there to develop an HDTV, but then there was something that was missing here. So the programming, like I said, is developed by a different party. So if you think about their incentives, there is a significant cost in making the investments in the technology and the infrastructure that would be required to produce high definition programming. And unless there is a sufficiently large base of consumers that have the HDTV, then the returns on such investments and the returns on such investments will be low and cannot justify the upfront investment in developing the HD programming. So this is kind of a catch-22 situation. Okay, so that is the demand for HD TVs depends on the availability of HD programming, and the supply of HD programming depends on the base of the number of customers with HD TVs. So unless we break this circularity, products in such markets will not take off essentially. Now, of course, government regulations in this market, which require the networks to move to digital programming by a certain time frame, have helped with the diffusion. Similar, the endogeneity between support and demand were experienced by Kodak when it introduced the Advantix film many years ago, which allowed customers to take pictures and store it in different formats relative to the 35 film, which allowed you to store the picture only in one format. So the problem with the Advantix film was that it could only be processed in some locations as it required a more advanced processing center. Now, this was not something that the consumers were aware of when they actually purchased the film. So while they could take the pictures with the advanced film, they could not have it processed. So the lack of educating the customers and the support in developing the film created a lot of problems for Kodak. So in this case, also the investment in the technology required to develop the Advantix film, it was costly, and an incentive to make this investment made sense only if there was sufficient demand for processing. But the demand for the film and processing in turn depended on how easy it was to process, which is similar to the HDTV example. Again, a catch-22. Now, even in the absence of these endogeneity issues, it's actually worth noting that new products fail at a very high rate. So that's what I was talking about, especially if you look at the CPGs. So more than 80 to 90% of the new products failed. So that's like on an average, the number of new products that are launched every year, about 80 to 90% of these new products fail. And these are consumable products that I'm talking about. So there are numerous examples here. Popular ones being New Coke, Zapmail, Betamax by Sony, which was actually superior to the VHS tapes when it came to the industry. So if you look at the industry standards for videotapes, Betamax by Sony was actually a much superior product than VHS, but somehow it failed. Now, similarly, in the consumer food, beverage, and healthcare products, more than 25,000 products are introduced every year, and only 40% last for more than 5 years. So failure rate in the industrial products are somewhat lower. They're around 30%. So the key question is, why do products fail? So if we have a good understanding of why products fail, we can circumvent these problems and possibly preempt our products from suffering from the issues that lead to potential product failures. Now, one of the key reasons products fail is often that there is no significant point of difference from the other competing offerings in the marketplace. So a lot of times is redundancy. People are used to consuming a product. So when a new product is launched, sometimes is now the new product may not be significantly different than the other product. That's usually the number one reason why a lot of products fail. So in other words, the value proposition, if the value proposition is weak, and as a result, there is no good reason for consumers to purchase your product over the alternatives available in the market, certainly a product is going to fail. So in other cases, the market or the product may not be defined properly. That's also a reason why new products may fail, which can happen if consumers' needs are not kept into mind when the new product is being developed. Okay, so you have to understand the consumer's underlying needs. These are the core principles where pretty much all new products should be designed, keeping these principles in mind, keeping these key concepts in mind. So Apple's Newton is an example of such a failure. Or for that matter, Sony's Betamax, which we talked about earlier, is also an example of an ill-defined product. So in that case, Sony's Betamax had a capacity to store videos for 60 minutes. In fact, most movies were around 90 minutes long. So this required the consumer to change the tape, where the competing VHS tapes, which entered the market later, had a capacity of 120 minutes, which did not require the interruption. So a lot of times your product may be superior to begin with, but maybe a competing product can. So when your product is trying to diffuse in the market, is diffusing in the market, maybe a competing product may come up with a better, with some added attributes, given the challenges that a new product is facing. So they can always come up with a better product later when the product is trying to diffuse in the market. So sometimes the demand or the market is smaller than anticipated. That's another reason. So the demand or the market may be smaller than anticipated demand, and the company is unable to recoup the investments that went into the product development. So this can happen even if the product is of high quality. So inaccurate demand forecasts can also result in product failure. So another reason why a lot of products fail could be poor execution of marketing mix, which may also result in product failure. So Minute Maid introduced squeeze fresh orange just in a bottle, where you could squeeze the concentrate into a glass of water to make orange juice in a hurry. But the design of the bottle dispensing the concentrate was pretty bad, and the concentrate would crust and it would just get too messy, which again limited the success of what was otherwise a good idea. So it was a great idea, but very poorly executed. Now, it all was, so maybe the packaging strategy was messed up in Minute Maid's case. So, right? So when we talk about marketing mix, we're talking about all the four P's, where we are also talking about the product. So as one of the P's, and when we talk about product, we also, as marketing managers or product managers, we also have to come up with the right packaging strategy. So if that's done poorly, then most likely a product is going to again fail. So now another reason why products fail could be bad timing. So bad timing, particularly in high-tech markets, is a common reason for failure. So in the high-tech market, the product life cycle is often very short, maybe 6 months to a year. And if the product launch is delayed by a few months, you have missed a good chunk of the life cycle. So in these markets, the pioneering advantage is important, and consequently, delays in introductions can have serious repercussions on the product success. So if with a lot new products, it can be very costly to get access to shelf space at the retailer, and this is especially true for smaller players or brands that are not established. Now, product failure can also result because the product positioning is not clear, as in the case of Kodak's Advantix, or because of some inadequate support. Okay. All right, so now let's talk about the different approaches to new product development process. So there are three key approaches. The classical linear approach is one. With this approach, the different stages of the new product development process, which we'll talk about in a bit, take place in a linear or a sequential fashion. So, for instance, we first have the idea generation process, and then screening, and then so on in a sequential fashion. So now, with the Rugby approach, some of the stages of the NPD process, which is a new product development process, are undertaken in parallel. So, for instance, different departments within a company may work on different stages in tandem, and we will discuss some of the advantages of this approach in a second. Finally, there is a target costing approach where the firm undertakes the different stages of the new product process with the target cost per unit in mind. Now, regardless of the approach adopted, the NPD process has different stages, and some of these stages are more formal than others. So the first step of the NPD process is the idea generation or the concept generation stage. And there are several sources of these ideas. There could be employees, customers, research and development, and competitors are some of the sources of ideas. So a lot of firms actually formalize this process by employing think tanks to generate ideas. And then these think tanks can be internal to the organization, or they could be outsourced to a consulting company as well, who they kind of scan the trends. Now, an example of ideas generated by employees is the case of General Mills, which actually asks their employees for suggestions on new product ideas. So one of their employees used to observe a co-worker carrying granola in a Ziploc bag as a snack, and suggested that a snack idea to it's actually suggested that as a snack idea to General Mills, which resulted in granola bars. So a 3D employee similarly observed co-workers sticking notes in their cubicles to remind them of meetings and which resulted in the sticky notes. Now, competitors could be another source of ideas. Such BMW, for instance, was a late entrant in the SUV market and essentially introduced an SUV with features that their key competitors offered, and then some to make a dent in the luxury SUV market. So they were late entrants, but it was the competition that actually drove them to come up with this new product. Okay, so now after the first stage of idea generation, the ideas need to be screened because not all ideas may be worth taking to the market. So consumer surveys is one way to screen ideas based on their reaction to the concept. So once you get the survey responses, you can then perform analysis like conjoint to make inferences about consumers' preferences, which I'll show you shortly. Now you can also do focus groups to get response to ideas from the groups that you're trying to target. So we can also screen ideas by creating a prototype and then use that to demonstrate the idea or concept and again get customer response to the idea or concept. So let us now look at a statistical tool called Conjoint and see how that can allow us to screen ideas or screen good products from bad ones. So now with Conjoint, the basic idea is to think of the product as a bundle of attributes which yields some value to the customers. So the value that consumers derive from the product is presumed to be a weighted sum or a linear combination of the attributes, and the goal is to estimate the weights that customers associate with the different attributes. Now, each attribute, of course, can have different values or levels. For example, the crust in a pizza uh, could be thin crust, thick crust, or pan. So the attribute crust in this case takes three different levels. So with Conjoint, we present consumers with different product bundles by varying the attributes of the product and have them rank the different bundles from the most preferred to the least preferred. We then use the preference ranking date to estimate the weights that customers have for the different attributes and different levels. Okay, so it's the ranking rate. Now, since this is an introductory course, I'm not going to go into the details of the technique. If you're interested in learning more about this technique, you should consider taking marketing research elective. So now let me illustrate how this technique can actually be used to screen the products using the pizza example. So let us say a packaged goods firm wants to introduce a new frozen pizza. Now you might consider different kinds of pizza that could be introduced. Based on focus groups, let us say the following attributes with different possible values have been deemed important. Now the 5 attributes in this case are crust, topping, type of cheese, quantity of cheese, and price. So the crust, type of cheese, quantity of cheese, and price each can take one of the 3 possible levels or values, while the topping can take one of 4 possible values. For simplicity, we are only going to consider the case of only one topping. So if you think the number of alternatives that are possible, there are about 324 possible variants of pizza. And our goal with Conjoint is to screen the concept. So rank ordering 324 possible alternatives in descending order of preference is a cognitively challenging part, if not impossible. It's not impossible task, but it's quite challenging. Now, fortunately, it turns out that we can estimate the weights or part worths of the different attribute levels with 16 alternatives. Now, how you decide which 16 alternatives to present is outside the scope of this class. But I will say that it's important not to present alternatives that are dominated. Okay, so for example of a dominated alternative would be one where two pizzas have identical attributes, except one is priced at $7.99 while the other is priced at $8.99. So the one priced at $8.99 is dominated. So while you have narrowed down the alternatives, the conjoint will generate the following output. So this output is based on the individual consumer's ranking. Let us now think about what to make of these numbers. So the first row in each of these tables tells us the maximum value each attribute can take. So for this customer, thick crust is the most preferred crust, which yields a value of 15 points. When the quantity of cheese is 6 ounces, that yields a value of 10. Similarly, low price is preferred to high. So when we compare the numbers in the table, it allows us to determine which of the attributes are the most important. So for this customer, price is the most important attribute, worth 35 points, followed by topping, which is worth 30 points, and so on. So the weights for the type of cheese is actually on the next slide. So once we obtain these numbers, we can then rank alternatives with different attributes, with different attribute levels objectively. So let us take the two alternatives now. So using the numbers from the conjoint output, we can actually figure out the value that the two alternatives yield to the customer. The veggie pizza with a thin crust, 2 ounces of Romano cheese, priced at $7.99, yields 55 units of value or utility, while the pepperoni pizza with 6 ounces of mixed cheese on a thick crust yields a value of 58. Comparing across the alternatives in this manner, we can allow the packaged good firm to screen across alternatives and take the alternatives that yields the most value to the consumer. Now, of course, the company will need to balance that with the costs and make sure that the alternative that is most preferred by the consumers is also sufficiently profitable. Okay. All right, so once we've done the concept screening, we can enter the product definition state. So it's important when defining the product why it's important to define the product is to get the feedback from the customer. So during the feedback process, the consumer may have conflicting requirements. So for example, they may want a laptop which is small and light, but which is easy to type. It's kind of conflicting. A smaller laptop, it's usually hard, when you want to type, it's not that easy to type on a smaller one. So the former requirement implies a smaller laptop, while the latter requires the opposite. So when we have conflicting requirements, again, conjoint analysis can be really useful because it tells us which attribute has higher weight. So in our example, if ease of typing has a higher weight relative to the size of the laptop, then that has implications for the design and definition of the product. So the link between the underlying consumer need and the physical characteristics and the attributes of the product is also established, the house of quality idea, which is discussed at length in the book. So this is particularly relevant in designing of complicated products like automobiles. So once the product definition step is complete, then we enter the testing phase, where a variety of tests that need to be conducted. So initial tests can be conducted by a small sample of customers, consumers, or the company's own employees. Now, these initial tests are intended to catch any obvious problems before it's too late to rectify the problems. So some problems inherently arise over extended use. Now, to track such problems, a panel of consumers can be employed to use the product over an extended period of time and share their experience and feedback to identify and tackle any problems that arise. So P&G does that a lot, especially with the laundry detergents. They actually choose a panel of women who come and actually use the product in their labs right at the P&G facility or at home, and they actually share their experiences. So that can actually give that information that they collect from such an effort is actually very useful for the firms before the product is actually fully launched. So once these sets of tests are done, firms will then often conduct field tests to get estimates of trial rate or repeat rate or consumption rate. So this information is extremely useful in forecasting demand. So a related question is, how do we choose the test markets? So with packaged goods, there are some small markets like Springfield, Illinois, Fresno, California, which are used to run these field tests because the population in these markets is a good representation of the national population. So there are a few states that are chosen so these are also, it's also part of your testing. So other decisions related to market tests are how long to test, how much to spend, and what information to gather, in addition to the measures that we discussed earlier. So how long to test? Obviously, the longer you test, the better, since the results you estimate will be more robust with more precision. However, if you test for a long time, the downside is that you may actually give your competitors time to react. So because if the product has hit these test markets, like a few states, then the downside is then the competitors can actually get a lot of information about your product, and they may actually even emulate the product if you don't have any copyrights. And essentially, testing it for a long time has its own demerits. So similarly, the promotional expenditures and other investments in pushing the brand in the test market should also be made at levels that can be sustained when you roll out at the national level. So once the results from the market test is satisfactory, the product is rolled out, but we are not done yet. So post-rollout support is very important. As we saw in the case of Kodak, the product almost failed because of lack of post-rollout support. So having a quality product is necessary, but not sufficient for product success. So the importance of post-rollout support cannot be underscored enough, as the ultimate success of a product hinges in many cases on its existence. So these are the different stages of the new product development. Now, with the classical linear approach, as I mentioned earlier, the different stages are undertaken in a sequential manner. And because of sequential nature, there could be bottlenecks which may extend or fasten the product development process. So more importantly, with this approach, the level of interaction between the different departments in the company is somewhat limited. And as a result, the different parties involved in the product development process may not be sensitive to the demands or the constraints faced by the other teams. For example, the consumer research done by the marketing department may reveal that the consumer wants a light laptop which is convenient to type, while the production department may relay to the marketing team that this just is not a technically feasible approach. They cannot produce a product. It's not technically feasible, and rightly so. So this product is actually overcome with a rugby approach, where the product development teams are cross-functional, with members of the marketing team, development team, they work cross-functionally. So the goals of the product development are laid out, and then the teams work with different steps of the product development done in parallel when possible. So the constant interaction among members of the team minimizes bottlenecks, as the entire team is more or less on the same page. So the members of the department of the different teams are also more sensitive to the demands and constraints because it's a team effort. Now, finally, there is a target costing approach. Now, with this approach, the marketing research determines or estimates the price, and the end consumer, the price that the end consumer is willing to pay for the product. So the intended margin for the product is certain, and based on that, an upper bound on cost is calculated. The product development process is then geared towards optimizing the product design, quality, and attributes so that the cost is kept low enough to obtain the desired profit. So once again, regardless of which of the three approaches the companies adopt, all the stages of the new product development process are conducted.